we did a class on the fact that Moshe carried Yosef's remains out of Mitzrayim. We never finished it. I don't know if you remember the class. Atzmas Yosef. The idea that when the Jewish people left Egypt, Yosef HaTzadik, remember with this whole discussion we had, that when the Golus started, there were two reactions and two tzaddikim. Yaakov Avinu had one reaction, and Moshe Rabbeinu had an opposite reaction. Yaakov Avinu's reaction to Golus was, get me out of here. I don't want to be here. How did Yosef respond to the prospect of Golus? I'm with you in the Golus, but when the Golus is over, take me along, right? Remember? So, Yosef's role in the exile, that he remains in Golus with us, Yosef stays in Golus with us, and when the Jewish people leave Egypt, they take him along. And it says in Midrash Chazal that the Jewish people swore to Yosef HaTzadik that they would not leave the country without his remains, and everybody forgot about him. Who's thinking about Yosef? He can collect wealth. They were running around accruing wealth. They were taking Egyptian wealth before they left, and everybody forgot about Yosef except for one person. Who remembered Yosef HaTzadik? Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu carries Yosef HaTzadik's remains with him, and for the 40 years in the midbar, Moshe keeps an eye on Yosef HaTzadik's remains. Yosef's remains are brought into Eretz Yisrael. They're buried in the city of Shechem, where they are until this very day, because Hashem had promised, Yaakov Avinu promised Yosef HaTzadik, that he's going to get Shechem achad al achecha. We learned this last week in the Siddur class. It came up that Yosef got above what all the other brothers got, the city of Shechem that was given to him, and that's where Yosef is interred. Yosef is buried. Now, parenthetically, there's a very gishmak Rashi. It's in Sefer Yeshua also. It says a very, very interesting thing. The Jewish people left Egypt, everybody forgot about Yosef. Everyone forgot about Yosef. The only one who remembered was who? Moshe Rabbeinu. Who looked after Yosef's remains for 40 years? Moshe Rabbeinu. At the end of the 40 years, Moshe Rabbeinu passes away, so Moshe cannot finish what he starts. Moshe takes Yosef out of Mitzrayim, he oversees, he watches his remains for 40 years. When they get to Eretz Yisrael, he's not there. So the last step of carrying Yosef HaTzadik's remains into Eretz Yisrael and then finally burying him in Shechem is not done by Yosef, it's done by all the other Jewish people. So there's a pasuk in Sefer Yeshua in the book of Joshua that says that the Atzmes Yosef, the remains of Yosef, that the Jewish people took out of Egypt, they buried in Shechem. The Shaitim pasuk. In Sefer Yeshua it says that the remains of Yosef HaTzadik that the Jewish people took out of Mitzrayim, they buried in Shechem. So the question is asked, the Jewish people did not take Yosef out of Mitzrayim. The Jewish people were not thinking about Yosef. The only person who thought about Yosef HaTzadik was Moshe. So how come in Sefer Yeshua is there no mention made of Moshe? It says the remains of Yosef HaTzadik that the Jewish people took out of Egypt, they buried in Shechem. The Jewish people didn't think about Yosef. Moshe Rabbeinu did. So you have the famous idea, which is brought in Sfarim, that Hakel Nikra Al Shem Goimra. If 10 people do a project, one starts it, the next one continues it, the credit goes to the one who finishes it. So in other words, even though the Yidden had worked so hard to carry, Moshe Rabbeinu, had worked so hard to carry the remains of Yosef out of Mitzrayim and to carry them through the midbar and look after them for the entire time, the credit for carrying Yosef out of Mitzrayim is not given to Moshe because he was not able to finish what he started. The credit is given to the one who finishes the job, which is an interesting hayron avoida. When you start something, you got to finish it, because if you do 99% of something, and someone comes along and does what's called in Torah makeh bepatish, he hits the hammer one last time and completes the task, he's given credit for the ganze ma'aseh, for the whole story. Anyway, so Moshe Rabbeinu carries the remains of Yosef out of Mitzrayim. Why? Because Yidden cannot leave Mitzrayim without Yosef. The Jewish people swore to Yosef HaTzadik, they're not going to leave his remains behind, they're going to take the remains of Yosef HaTzadik with them. Okay, good? Yeah. Now, here's a siach from the Rebbe, where the Rebbe analyzes this question. The Rebbe says, I accept that the primary reason that the Jewish people took Yosef HaTzadik's remains out of Egypt is because they promised Yosef they would take him out of Mitzrayim. Or in the words of the Sicha, if you can look on page 86, Look on page 86, the right column, the first underline, it says, Afal Pi. Was das Nehmen Atzmis Yosef is beikir an Inyan was is l'shayach zu Yitzias Mitzrayim. The primary reason they took the remains of Yosef out of Egypt is because they couldn't leave Egypt without it. They could not leave Mitzrayim without the remains of Yosef HaTzadik. Right? Kashbos Yosef Poka Yifked Elakim Escha Alisum Esatzmeisai. Says the Rebbe is das aber eich verbunden. It's also connected with V'yasav Elakim Esam Derech HaMidbar, the fact that they're going into the desert. The Rebbe's Sicha is predicated on an argument. You're not leaving Mitzrayim. They had to take Yosef along. Why? They promised they would. The Yidden promised they would not leave Mitzrayim without the remains of Yosef. They took him along. So let's use these words, yeah? But everything is, after all, b'hashgacha pratis. Everything is precise. So even if it's true that the Jewish people took the remains of Yosef HaTzadik out of Mitzrayim because they couldn't leave without it, but consequently they carried Yosef with them into the desert. Says the Rebbe, you must say also that when the Yidden are carrying the remains of Yosef in the midbar, carrying Yosef remains in the midbar was necessary, not only so they could leave Mitzrayim, but in order for them to be able to journey through the desert. This is the observation in the Sikh. And if you look at the last paragraph on page 86, and I'm going to start reading from there, okay? Page 86, the last paragraph, which is underlined, I'm going to start reading from there. V'yashloimar, we could say perhaps, as das gufa, kum der posuk madgish zayin, the Torah wants to underscore and emphasize, as aroiz geindik from Mitzrayim, that as the Jewish people left Egypt, hat Moshe genumen mit sich atzmeis Yosef. Moshe Rabbeinu took along the atzmeis Yosef, that means the essence of Yosef. Was atzmeis werden azay angerufen, the reason the bones of a person are called atzmeis is weil ze seinen etzem v'tekev ha'adam ha'balchai. The bones of the person are only bones, but they're the strength of the person. In other words, the atzmius, the essence of the person, is called atzames from Yosef. And the Rebbe says, in other words, etzem and yanash Yosef. When the Jewish people left Egypt, they took Yosef's atzames. Atzames literally means bones. But the Rebbe says, don't read atzames as bones, read atzames as etzem. They took along the essence of what Yosef is. Und das, and this idea, mitnemen atzmes Yosef, to take along with them the essence of Yosef, is be'irkenegeya, is important primarily because the Jewish people are going to have to go to the desert. Kidilakaman, says the Rebbe, I'm going to explain momentarily. On a simple level, they can't leave Mitzrayim without Yosef's atzames, bones. But when the Torah says that they took along Yosef's remains, and identifies Yosef's remains not as Aroinish Yosef, the casket of Yosef, or something to that effect, but identifies it by Atzames Yosef, the bones of Yosef, which means the essence of Yosef. The reason this is the allusion is because the Torah wants to teach us that carrying Yosef out of Mitzrayim was very, very important, not just for the past, but going into the future. Now, guys, I want to give you a little speech, okay? Not a long speech, a short speech. I hope. Okay? You know how Torah works? You know how Torah works? Torah works by building on itself. Torah works by building on itself. Or to say it in other words, lahavdil, all other chokhmah, all other areas of knowledge are developed by going away from the past. How do you advance an area of knowledge, of any kind of knowledge, whether it's a physical science or it's a biological science or even a social science? You take old ideas and you show what's wrong with them and you change them. That's not how Torah works. The reason this is not the way Torah works is because Torah comes from God. Torah passes through the minds of people, but not ordinary people, not common people, the greatest of the great. And we speak about the Ruach HaKodesh, right? The transmitters of Torah from generation to generation were divinely inspired. And we really believe that their words are the words of Hashem. And that's the credibility of Torah. So the way Torah works is that you don't push away the old to make space for the new. You build on the old. You take what was said before, you build, you develop, you build on the old. And the entire history of Torah is a series of subsequent scholars taking material that was said in earlier generations and developing them, compounding them, enhancing them, and so on. So what often happens is somebody will say something, a rabbi will say something once in 5 words. And someone will come along 100 years later, 200 years, look at these 5 words, look what these words are saying, and then build a mountain out of it. Okay, you want an example? I'll give you a very simple example. There's a medrash that says, Nisava Kadosh Baruch Hu liyas lo'idire b'tachtenim. Hashem had a desire to have for himself a home in the lowest realm. How many times does this say in the medrash? Twice. It's a grand total of 2 lines of medrash, or 3 lines of medrash, or 4 lines of medrash. These few lines of medrash have become an entire body of knowledge that we call Hasidus Chabad. That's how it works. You take someone says a statement, a Godel B'Yisrael Amiti, a rabbi says something, and then from this you build an entire building. You build an entire edifice out of a few words. Now, if you are familiar with Hasidus, and I'm not going to hold it against you if you're not. If you're familiar with Hasidus, you will find that there's an enormous amount of uniformity to Maimorim. When you learn one Maimer, and a second Maimer, and a third Maimer, and a fourth Maimer, very often it sounds like they're saying the same thing again and again and again and again. There'll be a few words, 2 words, 3 words, 5 words, a sentence, a paragraph, which is different and new. So what a later Rebbe will do, he'll repeat the Maimer which was said by the one before him, and the one before that, and the one before that. But he'll take those few words, those few lines that the Rebbe before him said, and make it into a world. You understand what I'm saying? You'll take a thought said by a Rebbe once in a few words and build from this a palace, a castle. That's how Torah works. The evolution of Torah is a Godel B'Yisrael saying words, and usually they're very repetitive. The Rabbeim, Gedeli Yisrael repeat what their predecessor said, and they add a nuance. A kvetch. How do you say kvetch in English? It doesn't have the right, a wrinkle. A wrinkle, a little nuance, a small little change. And someone, a Godel B'Yisrael, will come after him and build from that wrinkle a whole new world. Our Rebbe did this 1,000 times. Our Rebbe spoke more than any Rebbe before him. I mean, the amount of Torah we have from the Rebbe is incredible. And when you think about how many other things he was busy with, it absolutely staggers the mind to think how a person who was so busy with so many other things had time to give us so much Torah. But one of the things that the Rebbe likes to do is to take a thought that's been written in a book that no one ever thought about, and then to make from it a world. Okay? I'm going to give you a very good example. I'm going to give you a very, very good example for this. Okay? There is an expression, the Zohar, which if you lived 50 years ago, you would never have heard of. If you live today, you can't not hear it. The Zohar says, what is the meaning of the word Torah? What is the meaning of the Hebrew word Torah? Tav, Vav, Reish, Hey. What does it mean? What is the meaning of the word Torah? Tav, Vav, Reish, Hey. So the Zohar says the meaning of the word Torah is Heirah. It's a lesson. It's an instruction. That's what the meaning of the word Torah is. It's an instruction. The Zohar was written 1,800 years ago, right? It's a long time ago. A lot of people read this Zohar and looked at the Zohar and said, aha, and kept moving. How many times did the Rebbe say Torah Milashon Heirah? Thousands. The Rebbe took a Zohar that's been sitting there for all these hundreds of years. Anybody could have taken that one line of Zohar and built a whole building out of it, and the Rebbe made a whole religion out of it. You know what the Rebbe's religion is? That there cannot be a word of Torah without a lesson. It's impossible that something should say in the Chumash or in the Tanakh or in the Chazal and not be a lesson. Why not? The Zohar says, Torah Milashon Heirah. You follow what I'm saying? The Rebbe found one line in the Zohar and created a whole new understanding. The Rebbe can take any word of Torah and ask you legitimately, what's the lesson? And you cannot answer, what do you mean? This is not a lesson, this is history. This is not a lesson, this is a story. This is not a lesson, this is a fact. The Zohar says Torah Milashon Heirah. You understand? And that's how the Rebbe developed his original contribution to Torah. He takes this one line, Torah Milashon Heirah, and makes out of this a world. The Rebbe said Torah Milashon Heirah thousands of times. In every Sikh, in every Maimer. When the Rebbe first became Rebbe, he didn't use the word Torah Milashon Heirah. At a certain point, the Rebbe quoted this Zohar, and I would love to find when. You know, if you study the Rebbe's Torah, you can watch these things evolve. You can watch the Rebbe quote a source, bring it up, and talk about it, and then it'll become a part of the lexicon. It just becomes a part of our language. We don't even know where it started. We don't realize that before the Rebbe became Rebbe, the Zayar existed. No one thought twice about it. You follow what I'm saying? And the Rebbe did this often. He would frequently come up with a new line, a new thought, a new insight. Thank you very much, man. And he would introduce it. He would talk about it, and then he'd make it into a world, and then it was a part of the language of Lubavitch. It became so mainstream, you thought that people have been saying this for hundreds of years, and it's not true. It started in Tufshin 1957, 1963, whenever the Rebbe decided to develop this idea. And I can go on and on. I can give you many, many examples. I'm going to give you one more example, because I want to do this. The Rebbe would often quote a Maimon Chazal, mitzvah lefarseim oisei mitzvah. Do you understand Hebrew? It's a mitzvah to publicize those who do mitzvahs. Mitzvah lefarseim, it's a mitzvah to, if you did a good thing, the whole world should know about it. Don't keep it a secret. Who said it? Who said mitzvah lefarseim? I'll tell you who said it. I only know it because in the Sichos. The Rashba said it. Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes. He lived 700 years ago. Mitzvah lefarseim oisei mitzvah. Now, if you know anything about the history of Jews, especially the history of Hasidim and Hasidus, you know that we're all about tznius. You do a good deed, make sure nobody knows. Shh. The best way to do a mitzvah is keep it a secret. The Rashba said 700 years ago, mitzvah lefarseim oisei mitzvah. When the Rebbe first became Rebbe, he introduced this Rashba, and he agonized over it. How do you reconcile the idea that if you do a mitzvah, you should publicize it with the idea that ein lecha yafa min hatznius? So for a long time, maybe for 10 years or even more, the Rebbe would bring up that Rashba and say, well, you should be mefasim it, but you shouldn't be mefasim. You got that tznius, but you have to have not tznius. Anyway, by the time I was growing up, mitzvah lefasim oisei mitzvah could have been a pasuk in Chumash. In other words, I didn't even know that when the Rebbe first became Rebbe, he introduced that Rashba that existed for hundreds of years. The Rebbe did not invent it. It was sitting there in the books, waiting for someone to take out of a sefer and to build it up. And the Rebbe struggled with it for a very, very long time, so to speak. And finally said, okay, this is it. You understand? And I can go, there's many, many things that the Rebbe did like this. He would find a piskom, a pasuk, a Maimon Chazal, that it's been in the books for hundreds of years, and nobody noticed. And then he would make it into a whole world. And then you would say, like, what's the big deal? It says in Medrash. He says, yeah, it is a big deal, it says in Medrash, but until 40 years ago, no one ever heard of the Medrash. So here's an example like this. It's a quote from the Tzemach Tzedek. Look at footnote 21. It's a quote from the Tzemach Tzedek. And the Rebbe made from this Tzemach Tzedek a ganze Welt. Now, the reason the Rebbe made such a big deal out of this is for two reasons. First of all, because the Tzemach Tzedek says this about Yosef. And second of all, because it happens to be the name of the Friedrich Rebbe. The Friedrich Rebbe's name is Yosef. So the Rebbe found that Tzemach Tzedek passed away over 150 years ago. In the Tzemach Tzedek's notes, you have this idea, but whoever thought about it? And the Rebbe made from this one line, or this, if you look in the footnote 21, you bring it in 1, 2, 3, 4. Apparently Tzemach Tzedek said it a number of times, but whoever heard of it? And the Rebbe made from it a ganze Welt. And what is it? Yosef HaTzadik's name was Yosef, correct? His name was Yosef. Who named him? Who named Yosef Yosef? Anybody know who gave Yosef his name? His mother, Rachel. Why did she give the name Yosef?
To add one more son.
So there's two insights. There's two. The first is Asaf Hashem Eschel Pasi. The word Yosef has in its shadish to gather, to collect. Asifat, to bring together. Asaf Hashem Eschel Pasi. Rachel said, until now I had shame. Now that I have a son, Hashem has gathered in my shame and hidden it away. It's the first thing it says in the pasuk. Asaf Hashem Eschel Pasi. Hashem gathered in my shame. And Rashi explains it very simply. Yeah, if a person makes a mistake, person breaks something, says, why did you do it? Yeah, when you have a little kid, you say, he did it. That's what Rashi says. That Rachel now can blame all her foibles on her little boy. She has a son. Okay, if something happens in my tent that's going to make my husband upset, I'll say he did it. That's what Rashi says. Asaf Hashem Eschel Pasi, the Eibishter has gathered in my shame. And that's why she names him Yosef. So the first reason for naming him Yosef is that Hashem has gathered in my shame. But then she says something else. Yosef Hashem li bein acher. Hashem should give me another son. Right? Now, why does Rachel say, Yosef Hashem li bein acher? Why does Rachel say Hashem should give me another son? Anybody know the answer? Because she knew with Ruach HaKodesh that Yaakov was going to have 12 sons. And Yosef was the 11th. So Leah had 6, Bilhah had 2, Zilpah had 2, and Rachel davens, Yosef Hayeli bein acher, that the last of these 12 sons should be mine. That's what it says in Rashi. Yosef Hashem li bein acher, I prayed that the last of the 12 sons of Yosef, of Yaakov, should be mine. And of course, if you learn Chumash Rashi, one of the most underemphasized pieces of the story in Pashas Vayetze is as va'achar yol labas. Right, Leah had 6 sons, and then she had a daughter, Vatikra Shmo Dina. What does Rashi say? That when Dina was conceived, she was meant to be a male, a boy. And Leah knew that Yaakov was going to have 12 children, so she asked Hashem that he be a girl. The word Dina from the word Din. She judged herself so that her sister should have at least as much as the maidservants, 2. Right? I'm telling you things you know, I hope. Correct? Okay? So the reason Yosef, anybody need a copy? The reason Yosef Atzadik's name is Yosef, can you pass him down? The reason Yosef Atzadik's name is Yosef is number one, because it connotes to gather in, to collect, to bring in the shame of Rachel Imenu. And number 2, she names her son Yosef, Hashem should give her a second son. Okay? So the Hebrew words are Yosef Hashem li bein acher. Hashem should add for me a second son. So the Tzemach Tzedek comes along, and he says, Yosef Havaya li bein acher has to be read to mean men daf machen von acher aben. You take somebody who's acher. What does acher mean? Outside, lost, behind, neglected, forgotten, and make from him a son. I'm repeating myself again. The simple title of the words, Yosef Havaya li bein acher, is, I have one son, Hashem should give me a second son. So that Tzemach Tzedek says 150 years ago that the meaning of these words, Yosef Havaya li bein acher, that Hashem should give me a second son, are that I should find someone who's in the category of an acher, who's lost, who's outside, who's behind, who's forgotten, and I should make him into a son. Tzemach Tzedek said it in his Maimorim, and the Rebbe made this into Aleph Beis. The Rebbe said it over and over and over again, because the Rebbe would very frequently, of course, refer to the Friedike Rebbe, to his predecessor, to what the Rebbe used to call the Rebbe de Shver, the Rebbe de Shver, the Friedike Rebbe. The Friedike Rebbe's name was Yosef, and whenever he would mention the Friedike Rebbe's name, he would say, what's the inyan of the Friedike Rebbe? He would have different things that he would mention, but one of them was that the inyan of the Friedike Rebbe was, like it's written on his tombstone, V'rabim heisha meyavin, to make Bali Tshuva. V'rabim heisha meyavin, to make Bali Tshuva. Yosef Havaya li bein acher doesn't only mean I should have a second son, but that I should find a boy or a girl who's in the state of acher and bring them close and make them into a son. You follow? This idea that I just shared with you becomes the basis of this sikha. The Yidden carry Yosef's remains out of Mitzrayim. Why? The Yidden carry Yosef's remains out of Mitzrayim. Why? Because they swore to, they promised to. Says the Rebbe, there's another reason. The Yidden carry Yosef's remains out of Mitzrayim because Yosef is the Koach to make from Acher Ben. Yosef is a tzaddik that has the capacity to go out into the world and find somebody who's in a state of Acher and bring him close to the Eibishter. I'll tell you an interesting story. It happened over 30 years ago. I was a boy in yeshiva, and I was in Los Angeles. I had an uncle, Oliver Shaw, may rest in peace. He was a wonderful man. He passed away pretty young. Who lived in Los Angeles, and I would go to his house frequently. And his shver, his father-in-law, was visiting. His father-in-law was a skvere chassid. In Muncie, there's a place called Square Town. His father-in-law was a skvere chassid. He had a becher from the Alta Skvere Rebbe. So we were sitting at the table, and my uncle's father-in-law said to me, the Rebbe sends bacharim on shlichus. The Rebbe sends young couples on shlichus. He says, in our culture, we know tzadikim machen balei tshuva. Tzadikim make bal tshuvas. Simple people have to sit in an insular environment, surrounded by by people of their own type and to be protected from the world and so on and so forth. He was asking a typical question, a question that you would ask. The people ask all the time, the Rebbe sent shluchim. I mean, you have to understand how great a miracle shlichus is. Remember, guys go on shlichus, girls go on shlichus. How old are they? On average, they're between 25 and 30. 25 and 30 is a little kid. You may not think so yet, but you'll find out. 25 and 30 is not exactly wise and adult. And they go to places where they're the only from couple, sometimes within hundreds of miles. And in some cases, they don't even have a mikveh. So the Rebbe was usually very careful. He wouldn't send shluchim, young couples, to places where there was no mikveh. It was sort of like an unwritten rule. The Rebbe did not send young shluchim on a shlichus unless there was a mikveh. And yet, there were exceptions. If the Rebbe trusted you, I know people personally. A guy told me that he was on shlichus someplace, and he told the Rebbe that his kids are getting bigger, and there's no education for his children, so he's going to have to move back. And you know what the Rebbe's answer to him was? Why? You'll raise them there. And I know the man, and I know the woman. And what the Rebbe was saying is, I trust you. I trust you. And they raised a beautiful mishpacha in the desert. But the bottom line is, shlichus is very young people going to places where they're very, very alone. And not only do they have to retain their own identity as Jews, they have to bring it to other people. So he says to me, how does the Rebbe take such an achrayus? And of course the answer is that when you go on shlichus, you're not going with your own wits and your own skill and your own religiosity. You're going with the koach of the Rebbe. The Rebbe goes with the shliach and shlichus. The idea that all of these couples go to these faraway places and not only they remain Yidden and Hasidim, but they're Makarav of somebody else, is such a big miracle that we don't even appreciate it. A young boy and a girl, that's what they are. They're young boys and girls. That's with all due respect, that's what they are. And they go to God-forsaken places. And they work very, very hard. And they change their environment without the environment changing them. It's a koach eliki. It's the Rebbe's koach. And the Rebbe always attributed it to the Friedrich Rebbe. Now, of course, you know what we think of that. But this is how he would phrase it. The Indian of the Friedrich Rebbe is V'Rabbi Meishem Hayavin. You go to a place which is called Acher, that everybody else forgot about. And you find a Jewish child, and you make him into a Ben LaKadosh Baruch Hu, you make him into a child LaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the meaning of Yosef. So the meaning of Yosef's name, the way that Tzemach Tzedek explains it in Chassidus, is that you go to a place where there is somebody who is in a state of Acher, forgotten, lost, behind, and you make him into a Ben. And the Rebbe would say it over and over and over again, over hundreds of times, because every time he would mention the Friedrich Rebbe's name, which was in every, the Rebbe never missed a chance to mention the Friedrich Rebbe, he would reference this idea, because this is how he saw the inyan of the Friedrich Rebbe. And of course we don't see it as the Friedrich Rebbe, we see it as the Rebbe. But that's the big argument to the Rebbe and Chassidim is, who's the Rebbe? The Rebbe always blamed everything on the Friedrich Rebbe. And we said, of course. Of course. The Friedrich Rebbe is the Rebbe. Yeah, of course. Anyway, but this is one of the expressions for this. And that's where this Sikha now goes. Yidden take Yosef out of Mitzrayim. Why? Because they needed to. Why? Because they couldn't leave without him. That's not the only reason. That's one of the reasons. The reason they take Yosef remains out of Mitzrayim is because only with having Yosef with them can they go out into the world. This is what gives them a koach to do what they need to do in the real world. Okay? We're going to